good afternoon to most of you. Good morning to some of you. As Teresa already introduced, my name is Cihlar. I work as a managing consultant at a consultancy called Guidehouse. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the sustainability criteria for green hydrogen production in Europe specifically. A little bit about the company I work for. So Guidehouse is a consultancy that works both for public and commercial sector. We have around 12,000 people globally. I work in the practice called Energy, Sustainability and Infrastructure. One of our focus areas is hydrogen and alternative fuels. And we have done quite a lot of work in the different aspects of hydrogen regulation, both in Europe and North America. And I'm going to be talking to you about part of that today. With that, let's jump straight into the interesting content. The first question really is, why do we need any kind of sustainability criteria for green hydrogen at all? And I think this chart illustrates this problem quite well. Worldwide, the most common method currently to produce hydrogen is with steam methane reforming. That's on the very left-hand side of this chart. And that's a very greenhouse gas intensive process, as you can see. But when a lot of people talk about the alternative production method for hydrogen, which is electrolysis, they might not realize that if you were simply to put an electrolyzer in Germany and connect it to the grid, for instance, in 2018, as shown on this graph, then the emission footprint of that hydrogen produced via electrolysis would be even higher, or at least equivalent to those made from natural gas. So that's, of course, something that we want to avoid. Therefore, we need to bring the greenhouse gas intensity of the hydrogen produced more to the right-hand side of the chart, where with different criteria you can achieve a very low emission footprint. I will remark that, of course, in Asia and I think also in India, another very common production method is coal gasification, but that, of course, has even higher emission footprint than making hydrogen from natural gas. There are many different standards already in place or in development that aim to define essentially what green hydrogen is. This list here is not exhaustive, but you can see that on the European Union level, there is a couple of different standards that are trying to define that. In Germany, there are standards as well as Netherlands, France, or California. But I think also Paula will talk later specifically about the one in Germany that her company is working on. So she will give you more insight into that. What I will focus on is at the top line of this slide. So the definition of green hydrogen under the Renewable Energy Directive in Europe, which essentially is binding for all European countries and also for potential imports of green hydrogen to Europe. I'll not bother you too much with the legal language, but what is important to remember is that the Renewable Energy Directive 2, or RED, as you can see it on this slide, essentially sets out, is one of the most important laws guiding the energy transition in Europe. And it also defines the criteria for green hydrogen production in Europe. There's a specific term that it uses, and maybe good to illustrate it here because I will be using it throughout the presentation. It calls the green hydrogen RFNBO or RFNBO. That means renewable fuels of non-biological origin. It's a mouthful, but in a simple way, it means essentially green hydrogen made from electrolysis using renewable electricity, and also synthetic fuels that are potentially derived from that hydrogen. The Renewable Energy Directive differentiates 3 production cases for that green hydrogen or RFNBO. Let's start with case 1. Case 1, also called the average grid electricity, is essentially for countries which already have significantly decarbonized electricity grid, so very low emissions in their electricity grids. And there it simply says the share of the total produced green hydrogen in that country will be equivalent to the share of renewables on the electricity grid. How would that work practically? This is one of the ways to illustrate it. So the lines that you see here are essentially the average greenhouse gas grid emission intensity factors for different European countries. And that green area at the bottom and everything below it are countries that are meeting a predefined threshold for how low essentially their grid emission intensity has to be eligible for case 1. There is a predefined essentially threshold in the Renewable Energy Directive that says that only if a country has a very low grid emission factor, then that potentially can be considered for case 1. If you want to take a look at a specific example, let's take Sweden, which is the orange line at the almost very bottom. So Sweden would then qualify for this criteria under case 1. And I think Sweden has around 50% of its electricity on annual basis coming from renewables. The rest is nuclear. Therefore, if you were to produce 100 gigawatt hours of hydrogen in Sweden under case 1, 50% of that, so 50 gigawatt hours, would qualify as this green hydrogen. So that's case 1. The other option under the Renewable Energy Directive is case 2, which is called direct connection. And that's maybe the simplest way that's illustrated in the Renewable Energy Directive. What that means is that you could either have what's called a isolated direct connection between the source of renewable electricity, meaning the wind farm, the solar farm, or the hydropower farm, hydropower plant, and the electrolyzer. So there is only essentially a cable between those two and no grid connection whatsoever. The alternative to that would be essentially a direct grid connection, but also direct connection between the renewable electricity plant and the electrolyzer, but also grid connection. And in that case, you would have to apply smart metering. This case 2 essentially is foreseen as a fast track because it, in theory, is the easiest way to implement, and the European Commission also thinks that this case will be applicable into many international countries. And because, as you will see in just a moment, the last case, which is called the case production case 3, is quite a bit more complicated, but it might be the most common, at least at the beginning. So moving on to case 3, you will see that that defines cases in which you still want to put your electrolyzer into a country which has actually not decarbonized its electricity system. It still has very high emissions coming from the electricity system, but you want to put your electrolyzer there, you want to connect it to the grid, and you would like to claim that the hydrogen that you produce this way is again green, or the refundable, as the definition says. If you try to claim that, the Renewable Energy Directive defines 3 additional criteria that you would have to fulfill: additionality, temporal correlation, and geographical correlation. So let's dive into that specifically. A little bit about the definitions, what these 3 criteria mean under case 3. So additionality essentially means that the fuel producer or the hydrogen producer would be adding to the deployment or financing of additional renewables, additional renewable electricity generation on the grid. simply meaning that for each megawatt of capacity of electrolyzer, there should be an equivalent of that, more or less, added in terms of wind electricity generation, solar, etc. The second element or requirement is regarding temporal correlation between when the electricity is produced and when the electricity is consumed. We will get into detail about that in just a second. And the last, but definitely not least requirement is geographical correlation, which says something similar. It essentially says that there has to be some kind of correlation between where the electricity is produced and where it is being consumed. Why is all this important at all, actually? Why to make it so complicated and have all these extra criteria on the production? Essentially, the starting point is that if you would have no additionality, so again, if you would just simply place your electrolyzer and start producing a lot of green hydrogen somewhere without adding additional capacity of renewables on the grid, then you would take away from direct electrification, from electric vehicles, from electrification of heating, etc. And in many countries, that would actually lead into increased fossil electricity generation, because in many countries, the marginal plant would be the fossil generator, whether it's coal, natural gas, or oil, depending on the specific country. So that's why additionality. The temporal correlation has a somewhat similar idea why it's there. Again, temporal correlation meaning that there has to be some kind of equivalence between when the unit of electricity, renewable electricity, is produced and when it's being consumed. That's there because if you imagine that you're an electrolyzer operator and you would be operating also at night, so you'll be operating 24/7, but you would only source your electricity from a solar farm, then obviously the solar farm cannot cover your consumption at night. And you would be at night, at minimum, again, increasing fossil electricity generation. The last bit here is the geographic correlation. That essentially means a simplest example would be, imagine that you place the electrolyzer in one country that is quite far away from where your contracted wind or solar farm would be. And there is simply no physical way of those electrons reaching you. That would mean that maybe you help to add additional renewables in the country that you're sourcing from, but locally you would again increase emissions because your consumption would have to be covered by the local electricity generation, in many countries most likely by fossil. So that's why the Commission the European Commission put those criteria in place. And the last bit I wanted to show you is about how this could be practically implemented. This is as far as what's publicly known. My company has been supporting the European Commission in developing the ways to implement the regulation. So this is a summary of what also we have been discussing quite intensely with them. On the additionality, how to fulfill that would be that you essentially strike a power purchase agreement, so a direct contractual relationship between the renewable electricity plant, wind or solar, and that would also have to be new. So it would have to be all built recently, and there's a specific, of course, criteria for what recently means. And it also should not be subsidized. So it should be fully financed by the developer under market prices, essentially, or prices that are agreed with the hydrogen producer. There is an alternative to it in which also older renewable electricity plants coming away from the subsidy schemes, as in the case, for instance, with a lot of onshore wind in Germany, that will be coming, will no longer be eligible for subsidy schemes. That if you can, as a electrolyzer producer, demonstrate that you can help extend with your financing the lifetime of that plant, that those could be also eligible, but that is more or less, I think, a marginal case. So what's important to remember is really that most likely what will be required in Europe, that there is a direct contractual relationship between the generators of electricity and between the hydrogen producer. The second, on temporal correlation, again, it tries to determine how strictly do you have to follow the electricity generation of the solar or wind farm that you have contracted, and that can be done very strictly. The maximum strictness possible in Europe is 15 minutes following, so in every 15 minutes you would have to adjust your consumption according to the production. It's not possible in all European countries. Some of them it's only possible on hourly basis, but you can make it much less strict. Of course, you can, for instance, just do yearly matching, in which you say, on an annual basis, I want the production of electricity that I've contracted to be the same to my consumption. An alternative to that, that's also defined, it's a system matching based on predefined criteria. So the simplest way to imagine that is that the electricity transmission system operator would say ahead to some of the electrolyzer operators that, well, there will be hours in which there will be a very high share of renewables on the grid, or the grid will have very low greenhouse emission factor. Therefore, you're allowed to produce regardless of what your contracted solar or wind farm is actually doing. So that's an alternative to the temporal correlation that's also being considered. And last but not least is the geographical correlation. So just quickly on that. In the most likely definition is that the solar or wind farm that you're sourcing from would have to be located in the same bidding zone. The concept of a bidding zone essentially is defined as an area where you have the same electricity market prices. And in Europe, that practically means in most instances a country, but some countries are split into multiple bidding zones, Sweden, Italy, for instance. And so that you would have to ensure that essentially your solar or wind farm is in the same country or same bidding zone as your electrolyzer. I know this is a lot to digest, especially if you see it for the first time, but I think what's important to remember is that there are different ways, essentially, that the Renewable Energy Directive defines how green hydrogen can be produced in Europe. We think that internationally, most countries will probably go, or most producers probably goes for case 2, that's their connection, but all three of them are potentially very important. The last thing I'd like to say is, and I think Miriam will talk about it a lot more later as well, is that all green hydrogen imports to European Union will have to meet these criteria that I just talked about in order to qualify essentially as green hydrogen, or that refundable term that I mentioned before. So this is, of course, important not only for Europe, but also indirectly globally. With that, I'd like to leave it at this. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be looking forward to the questions later on.